Yeah.
Okay. Well, welcome everyone to our webinar on making better spend decisions, breaking down attribution, econometrics, and incrementality. I'm Nicola, co-founder of CMO Circle, and this is one of the hottest discussion topics in our community. So, given my knowledge on this area is probably being generous about 1 out of 5, I thought it was time to bring in the experts. So I am delighted to welcome Jake and John from Day One Data to give us a crash course in attribution and answer some of the excellent questions you've all shared. But before I pass over to the Jays, could you all please introduce yourselves in chat if you haven't already and share how you are currently managing attribution in your business, which maybe we're just not. We will make sure we have time for questions at the end, so please do chuck them in chat as we go. And without further ado, over to Jake and John.
Nice. Yeah, thanks, Nicola. Let me quickly introduce us. So I think I know a few of you on the call. I think we've spoken before. So for those who haven't spoken to me or to John as well, I'm Jake, very excited for this webinar today. So I've always worked in data teams. I started my career off at a small retailer called Tesco, where I was in the analytics capability team. And I moved to Farfetch, where I ended up after my 4.5 years there, leading customer data foundations. So I was a principal product manager. And within my role, we basically look after any marketing acronym under the sun, from MMMs to MMPs to CDPs to single customer views. That was pretty much my role. So Farfetch had about a $300 million marketing budget. And my job was to create the data products to help us spend that in the most effective way possible, and also to personalize the proposition as best as possible to our end users. And passing to John to introduce himself.
Hi everyone. My name's John Napoleon Kofi, and I've got close to 15 years of experience in data. I actually started off my career building MMM models or marketing mix models, and I've sort of moved slowly more into the data foundations and infrastructure side.
I think we've lost John.
We've lost John. I thought it was the WeWork Wi-Fi that I was prefacing with.
Do you want to continue on, Jake, while we wait for John to come back?
Yes, of course, of course. So kind of as Nicola mentioned previously, you guys talked. You told us what you wanted to hear from this webinar, and we were going to do it anyway, but we pretty much listened to what you guys wanted. So in terms of what we're running through today, it's really these 4 core pillars. So talking about your attribution journey, what to do, what are the foundations, why do you need it, and how do you increase in your maturity? Why, if you're using first or last click attribution, which some of you definitely were from your survey responses, why it's not all that bad, and why we shouldn't need to take too much of a dramatic approach to it. It's still usable. Going into the deep dive burning questions around the optimal attribution strategies to get the most effective results. And lastly, on the hot topic of econometrics and marketing mix modeling, explaining how this is useful for things like brand measurement and also for various business types, for example, D2C and also B2B. So who is this webinar for? Well, it's pretty much for anyone. So if you're a business of any size, if you're omni-channel, if you're B2C or B2B, you've got a various degree of spend levels and different marketing strategies, there's always a way to help optimize what you do using data strategies. So many of these tools and techniques can be used independently for different frequency of optimization. But when they're all used together, that's how you hit that sweet spot of continuous optimization. So before we kick off, I thought it was quite good to talk about some definitions. Again, this might be overkill for some of you, but just making sure that no one feels excluded on the webinar. So attribution, very simply put, it's determining which marketing channels are responsible for driving sales. So assigning a contribution of that sale to a marketing intervention or action. Incrementality is just measuring the actual impact that a marketing activity has on a predetermined action. So for example, if you spend £1, it's how do you get £1.50 back, not just getting £1 back. And then econometrics, again, can be overcomplicated, but it's really at its core just about using statistical techniques to measure and analyze the impact of marketing and then subsequently optimize and scenario plan.
So I just wanted to say, Jake, econometrics. I'm sorry, I'm back. Yeah, econometrics is also interchangeable with market mix modeling as well.
Yes. Great. So as Nicola mentioned, and help me because I can't see the chat, but who here is at the start of their attribution journey?
Oh, hand raised, please. I'm definitely one of them. If everyone can work out how to do a hand raise.
You're going to have to tell me what percentage of people are raising hands?
We've got at least 8 so far, and it's going up out of 58. So yeah, a decent amount here.
Great. And the next one, who's using first or last click attribution?
And looking at the chat, a lot of people are using last click, and then perhaps how did you hear about us, or a exit survey when they register. So yeah.
Awesome. That is really useful context. And I think that works perfectly with the next few slides. So before we kind of get into the whole, the whole crux of attribution, attribution is a model. As we've mentioned before, it's a way of assigning a value to a marketing action. But as is the case with all models, they're all wrong. They're all right at the same time, but some are actually useful. So one of the key takeaways from this webinar is going to be, don't get too fixated with, accuracy or quality. Focus on simplicity to actually lead to a decision which can be made. So the model itself is always wrong because it's not the actual truth. And it's always right at the same time because it's modeled based upon the logic that you've set it. So this is the starting point. And this is basically what we're going to be going throughout this webinar life cycle. So it's good to hear that so many people are doing this first and last touch, and also including surveys. That is pretty much the V1 of what we'd say an attribution journey should really initiate with. So that's leveraging on-platform views of attribution. So that means going to Meta or Google and seeing, what the ROAS figure is for that platform or channel, or, coercing and centralizing everything into Google Analytics and using their view of attribution, which could be first or last touch, but also data-driven attribution, and then blending that together with customer surveys. And then that's it. You could just stop there. That's great. You've got consistent attribution. Everyone understands it. Just use that. You don't need to overcomplicate the process. But at the same time, if you did want to have a slightly more sophisticated way of measuring and assigning different values to those marketing interventions, there are other solutions that you can follow. For example, CDP and data warehouse, and then looking at things like ROAS modeling, multi-touch attribution, and marketing mix modeling. Incrementality is something that we're going to be speaking about as well. And this is something that, regardless of your business maturity, should be an always-on feature and a massive part of optimizing your spend strategy. And a quick mention to this box in red, if you are a pure e-commerce business, there are a number of Shopify apps and tools at your disposal to which you can sort of circumvent these more sophisticated attribution models. So they're more always on, things like Triple L and Polar Analytics. So that could be used slightly more interchangeably if you are a pure e-com business. Right. John's going to take over and explain a bit more about CDPs and data warehousing.
Cool. Thanks, Jake. So I wanted to start off with a case study for Farfetch. For those who are not aware, it's like a luxury fashion platform, similar to Amazon, but for, say, luxury fashion. And the use case we had at Farfetch was that we had a website originally, and then we moved to an app. And what we saw was increasingly our revenue on app was becoming greater than our revenue on website. And on the website, we were using Google Analytics, and we were almost using Google Analytics as our source of truth, and then saying, okay, let's just weight that up to think about how the app behavior is. But the app behavior versus the website behavior was very different. And we were using Apps Flyer as our sort of data source. So we had two different data sources, GA and Apps Flyer. They don't speak to each other. And it was almost like we were running half the business just using, we were running the full business using GA data rather than the blend of the two. So what my team was in charge of was building a attribution model that combined the GA and AppsFlyer data together, and then combined that with all our different marketing cost data. So we spent on various different platforms. And then we also had our internal source of truth, which was how many sales we made as a business. And sort of combining all these data sets together, we created like a blended attribution model that finally gave, I guess, our version of the truth in terms of how Farfetch was operating. And it allowed us to understand when we spend, how it was affecting, say, sales on the app versus the web. And then it allowed us to sort of manage our 300 million budget more effectively because we had a holistic view of our behavior on app and web, and then also all the combined costs associated with the marketing spend. So the name of the app tracking tool was called Apps Flyer, which is on the next slide. And we can see that sort of in the middle. So yeah, we had so many different data sources that we had to pull together. And I think the sort of first touch point is thinking about all the data you use or would like to use to make decisions, and then focus on getting that in a single place. So if we move on to the next slide, and there's sort of two ways of doing this. There's a focus on, like, you can hire a data engineering team and they can sort of go to the APIs and pull that data in. It's the solution that Farfetch went with originally, but what we realized is that we couldn't actually keep up with all the sort of API changes. And when it kind of constrained our marketing team, because when they wanted to spend on, say, a new channel, so TikTok comes out, we have to almost wait for the data engineering team to be ready to connect to the API and get that data. So what we did, we leveraged third-party ingestion tools. So popular ones are like Fivetran, Hevo, Funnel.io, etc. And they've sort of allowed us to connect to all these different marketing channel platforms and pull that data into a warehouse. And it's pretty simple. It's like you click a few buttons and you can get all your data into a central place. So once we had that, and this costs money, but it was well worth it in terms of not having to hire a full team of data engineers to do this. And then once you've got your data in a central place, there is like a bit of modeling and transformation, so you can connect all these dots together. And then we use a BI tool, so you can build dashboards on top of it. At Farfetch, we use Looker, but Power BI, Tableau are also very viable options. As I mentioned before, there is like a initial setup cost to create the right infrastructure. And these sort of third-party tools that sync your data to your warehouse can cost up to a few $100 a month. And then you also do probably need to hire a team to do the initial build. But what I think the thing that I'm sort of proud of in terms of my time at Farfetch is that once we built the infrastructure, it just ran every single day. And there was only a handful of times where we had to check or there might be an error that we had to focus on, but it normally was like at least 90% of the time, this was just running automatically. And it's just the initial setup costs and startup is the hardest part of this, of the journey. So I'm going to sort of deep dive into the difference between using sort of GA as a starting point versus the CDP route and the data warehouse. I think all companies as standard should be using Google Analytics or equivalent like Adobe to just understand their tracking on their website. It's fairly easy to set up. It's always on and it gives you just like a general direction of how things are going. Google Analytics has improved, so now you can actually use it for app. When I was at Farfetch, we couldn't use that ability, so that's why we used AppsFlyer. I think the negative points of using Google Analytics is that it's kind of a bit black boxy. Google has their own internal attribution model, so you don't really understand how they're attributing your revenue across all these different marketing channels. And at our time at Farfetch, we noticed that we were using a last click model, and it essentially meant it was very difficult to spend on display, which is more of a channel that it's not necessarily a conversion channel. It's maybe building up brand awareness, for example. And then also with like cookie privacy laws and things like that, the data that you get from GA can have gaps. However, with the CDP and the data warehouse, it's a bit more cumbersome to set up, but then you do have the ability to do multi-touch attribution because you track every single point of the consumer's journey, which I'll go on to later. It's also using first-party data, so it's less sensitive to people accepting cookie tracking. And I think you can also you can make smarter marketing decisions. So if you know that someone's opened an email 2 times, seen a notification, maybe you won't hit them with a retargeting ad because that'll be a waste of ad spend. If you've already hit them 4 times, 3 times, you probably shouldn't hit them again for a certain period of time. And the CDP kind of allows you to collect that data because you get that full customer journey. Next slide, please, Shape. So I wanted to sort of illustrate that here. So a lot of people mention last click, and I think the pitfall for last click is that you don't necessarily know all the subsequent touch points that led to someone taking action to buy. So in this case, this person has a journey of 20 days to buy something. And I think this is particularly relevant if the thing that you're selling has like a long, high consideration. So for example, in luxury fashion, if you're going to buy £1,000 handbag, you're probably not going to see an ad and convert straight away. It's going to take a couple of days for you to decide to buy and multiple touch points. So in the last click world, you would give all the attribution to a Google search. But actually, in reality, there was an element of a Google ad 20 days ago. There was a TikTok ad 5 days ago that had an influence. And having a CDP allows you to understand these customer journeys and potentially build your own custom attribution model. And at Farfetch, what we did is towards the end, we experimented with multiple touch attribution models. So you had a last touch one, a first touch one, a multi-touch one, and kind of looking at all 3 of them, you kind of got a sense of where to spend your budget.
John, can I just interrupt with a very quick question?
Hmm?
Can you give a rough idea of the cost for a CDP or DWH solution?
It varies a lot, but I think we can maybe follow up on that one and sort of give a bit of a ballpark.
Absolutely. Annette, we'll pop it, great question. We'll pop it in the follow-up email.
As a rule of thumb, typically CDPs were historically not that cheap. like potentially six-figure contracts for the year. But now I think a lot of the CRM style software products like HubSpot, etc., have built-in CDP functionality. CDP is quite a broad term. And then on the DWH data warehouse side, it's very much aligned with how much data you're storing. So if you're on the smaller end of a business, 5 years old, not processing a crazy amount of data, it would be pretty cheap for the most part. But if you're enterprise business with millions of users and millions of traffic therefore a day, then it can get a bit costly.
Cool. And then I wanted to sort of round off with another example where a similar vibe to the Farfetch piece, where the issue with this one was they had multiple brands that feed into the master Redpin brand, and they had multiple geographies, so EU, UK, and the US, and also Australia. And because of the way the business model worked, it was kind of affiliates and also had an element of how do you drive traffic to your website for someone to do a quote. So they had like just a mixed match of all these different attribution models. And what we did, it was centralize all of this into a single view, which finally allowed them to actually understand how the Redpin brand was performing. And once you understood how all the Redpin brand was performing, that allowed us to allocate budget across different brands and also different geographies, which actually unlocked a 1.5 million cost of efficiency. And I think the other key point for this is like once we built the data foundations, this data could be used for dashboarding, which I ended up creating 4 dashboards. But then it was also used for the analytics that unlock the 1.5 million cost efficiency. So when you create your data foundations, it locks so many more opportunities to use your data in a smarter way, not just dashboarding, but analytics, data science can go into machine learning, potentially go into AI as well.
Exactly. And that leads us on nicely to our next part, which is a ROAS-based optimization.
Dave, before we go, I've got 2 quick questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
Just to wrap up that session. Thank you, Freya. Does a CPD solution have the same challenge in terms of consent opt-out percentage of customers?
No, from a perspective. So Google Analytics, it will, but because CDP is using it's called like first party data or service side, essentially it's like the necessary cookies. So it's less of a challenge is the short answer. And do these models work cross device? It depends on your setup. So if you have like a universal ID that goes across web and app, it does. At Farfetch, we had this, so we could see if someone started on web and ended on app, or vice versa. We knew they were the same person. But again, that's based on getting the universal ID correct.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Great. And yeah, following on from what John mentioned, we've covered the, let's say, data foundations, right? There's multiple ways to ascertain and track your attribution. But then once you've set up something like an internal attribution model, it's not just measuring things firsthand, which unlocks and drives value. There's also a number of other use cases in the marketing field and suite, which can also be extremely valuable. So one of those is ROAS-based optimizations. And these are one of a set of tools to determine marketing effectiveness. Now, the reason why you have multiple different strategies, as I mentioned earlier, is because these all have different frequencies and different capabilities and also different eligibility factors. So for example, a ROAS model uses the internal attribution models that we mentioned previously based on UTM tracking. So that includes measurement of and optimization of all digital spend, whereas something like an MMM, marketing mix model, is more impactful and valuable for top of funnel brand media. Whereas something like incrementality testing is basically calibrating the ground truth, which can be done at any stage of your life cycle. So we're going to delve a little bit deeper into the ROAS models now, and then we're going to touch on marketing mix modeling and also incrementality testing later. So within the ROAS model optimization suite, you basically have these two options at your fingertips. So there's a budget optimizer model, which helps you to reallocate funds across different markets, products, and channels. And then you've got a forecaster model, which allows you to predict and scenario plan based upon different scenarios. So maybe we can ask a question as well. Who here knows about the law of diminishing returns? Nicola, you're going to have to help me out with the hands again.
Hand raise here. I think part of the challenge is, can people work out where to do the hand raise? Which, by the way, is under React, because it took me a while to find that when I first did this. Yeah, generally, we've got definitely higher percentage understanding diminishing returns than more on attribution. So yeah, so far 13 already.
Great, great, great. So what you're basically doing is your attribution model is the source of truth, right? And then you use your attribution model to create these types of curves. And once you have these curves, you can then determine where you're underspending, where your optimal range is, and where your saturation point is. Very simply put. And that's pretty much doing exactly what the budget optimizer model is solutionizing. So if you look at your spend over time and you look at your business's revenue, what you'd basically do within a ROAS-based optimization model is plot all of the different campaigns. It can be products, it can be different interventions that your business has had over time, and the amount of attributed revenue that has been assigned to that action. And therefore, you use various different analytical techniques to be able to explain what an S-shaped curve looked like. And as you remember, that S-shaped curve is very important for us to determine saturation points. Once we have that curve, we can make different investment decisions. So for example, when comparing product 1 and 2, we can see that they're both currently spending around £2 or they're both marginal ROAS is similar in terms of £2, but they're both at different points of saturation. So for example, in product 1, around the 2.6 mark of marginal ROAS is where the spend starts to become saturated, and slightly less in terms of product 2 at around 2.5. So this is really the fundamental basis of how you optimize using your ROAS-based curves, by determining where you are on the point of diminishing returns and scaling back or forward your spend based upon that stated objective. The difference with something like a budget forecaster is that it's slightly more robust in that it takes into account things like trends, seasonality, and non-media factors like bank holidays and promotions. So this makes sure that your curves are as accurate as possible. And this is why we would use the budget optimizer and the budget forecaster interchangeably. And then how do you actually use this for decision making? So the output of these different curves gives you a predicted revenue. And then you look into what your business's target revenue is, and you see that your weighted ROAS is 5.5 in this example. That means that as a marketeer, you could either spend 36K more to achieve that target, or you could have a 14% optimization. And then you use these certain tools based upon your attributed models to determine where you can actually make that optimization. The great thing about the MarTech tooling such as this is that you can also use this for commercial decision making. So for example, if you know you need 36K more in media spend, but that's just not possible, maybe commercial can back this up through either a lower price point for the product, or also a different promotion strategy. So we actually, as Day One Data, we produce this for a omnichannel athletic business called Hilo. They're very exciting as a business, and everyone should check them out. And they were spending on media around 20K a month, and they wanted to reduce that to about 10K. So we created these diminishing returns curves, as I just mentioned, to help redistribute and understand where we could make those reallocations. So what we were able to see within this is that despite them being on the smaller end of media spend, right, something that's maybe more achievable for a larger volume of businesses in terms of that 10K mark, it's still possible to use analytical tools to help optimize towards efficiency. So it doesn't just have to be a media mix modeling world. And when you do have that view just in GA or that internal attribution, you don't only have to use those tools to help guide decision making. There are other solutions out there to help you on that journey. So who is this for? So typically businesses with lower funnel spend, so for example on PPC, with an onus on digital spend as well, so nothing offline or brand related, for example, out of home, and they want to optimize on a more frequent basis. And so you can run these models on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, or even a quarterly basis, depending on what the business need is. So why is this actually a solution which people would use? So it's that frequency, which I've just mentioned. It's in line with company targets. So typically, and this was the same when we were at Farfetch, the business targets are made using a last click definition. Therefore, optimizing in a non-last click world means that there's a slight cannibalization of what should be happening with the business. So if you're optimizing towards multi-touch, but your business targets are set using last click, suddenly you have a bit of a disparity of kind of where you're trying to head to versus what the business, let's say like foundations are. Additionally, if you want to do cross-region allocation, this is really beneficial. So if you're spending money in multiple markets, because of the frequency, it can quickly inform testing. And then also something like MMM might not always be accurate for a business, or it might not be feasible based upon a number of qualifying factors that we're going to talk about in a minute. So this ROAS-based solution is a great option for loads of businesses who maybe can't or don't want to do econometrics, but they have this single source of truth within their internal attribution, and they want to use that to determine different saturation points on their diminishing returns. So that was why you should use it, but when should you not use it? And maybe you need something a little bit more sophisticated. So I mentioned that you can control for certain non-media factors, for example, seasonality, but it's not a multi-touch approach. It's not a multi-touch attribution model. It is not a marketing mix model. It still only leverages that directly trackable attribution. So those things that we're talking about from UTM tagging. And it's still only limited to digital channels. And that is where something like media mix modeling or marketing mix modeling can come in. So it's interesting. MMM is a really old school statistical method to attribute sales to different marketing interventions, but its rise in popularity recently is largely due to new cookie privacy laws. So things like Google's IDFA and DMA, different changes. So very simply put, it's a statistical model that estimates the impact of marketing channels on sales. The way I like to think about it is that it tells you what is the natural demand for your product or service without any of the interventions, without any understanding of how your competitors perform, or the seasonality, or new product releases, or SEO, or your media spend, your performance spend. And once it understands that information, it can assign a value to each of these different features. And that's how, once you know the true value of each of those features, you can create media plans based upon that information. The use cases of something like an MMM are pretty large and also quite limited at the same time. So an MMM is run on a quarterly basis. If you hear about always on or monthly MMMs, I would be slightly skeptical because it's typically a quarterly driver of decision making. So therefore, what can you do within that quarter is create, your top line budget. So it's very useful for things like macro budget setting on a quarterly basis or on an annual basis. Because it's using historical events and explaining those historical events and telling you the true incremental ROI of those events, it's very useful for marketing forecasting. So data teams typically work very closely with marketing teams to understand and determine different assumptions that's going to be happening in the next year. So for example, if we ran an MMM for a client in 2024 and they wanted to use that view to tell them what overall revenue of the whole business, not just marketing, could be in 2025, that is very possible, but you'd still need to determine a number of assumptions from the business team. For example, what's the promo calendar for the new year? What's the predicted marketing spend? How many new products are being launched, etc. And because you're using this as a tool to explain all key factors of a business, so not just the media factors, but also non-media, it can also be used quite interchangeably for commercial planning. So approach to pricing and approach to promotions. But obviously, the KPI in which you model will have a slightly different impact on that commercial aspect. I think I've mentioned this probably by mistake in my last two slides, but this is the reason why people choose MMM over internal attribution. So that is why this is sometimes favored over, but hopefully in addition to, your more traditional means of attribution. So for example, what John mentioned in terms of creating a data warehouse with CDP, creating that accurate, always-on measurement approach. This is kind of a supplement to that, is what we'd say. And that's because it's determining incrementality. So the other methods of attribution are giving you a snapshot view, let's say, of what's going on, but it's not telling you the joint impact of all of these interventions once being used in a varied media mix. And the reason why loads of people love this is because, in contrast to previously, this doesn't rely on UTMs, it doesn't rely on cookies. It's fully a cookieless tool, which is why it's much more popular these days. It's a great driver for top of funnel brand activity. So for example, if you have out of home, this can tell you what the ROI is of that brand activation. And same thing with non-media factors. So it takes into account things like inflation, seasonality, competitor impact, interest rates, and it uses this to help form this version of truth. And I say version of truth because it's still not the truth, it's still a model truth, but much more reflective of what's actually going on. And then once you determine all of these key factors, it can be used for scenario planning and budget optimization. So if you had the question, I want to spend 3 times more next month, is that a good idea? MMM is a really great tool to be able to tell you if the answer is yes or no. I don't want to get too stuck into this, but I know that we were talking a fair amount about last touch and first touch attribution, and MMM is definitely not that, but this is definitely not a last touch and first touch bashing webinar, because there is still a place for those methods of attribution, and largely because they're always on. So the way in which we see it is your last touch and first touch are much more foundational models that businesses of any size should be using, whereas something like an MMM is for the bigger firms who have more media spend, a varied media mix, and they have these versions of attribution, for example, last and first touch, but they use MMM for the more macro driver, for those bigger bets, for that wider decision making. So when I say it's not faultless, that's because it's not always on, as previously mentioned. It's a quarterly model, and it's not suitable for all companies. And there's a variety of qualifying factors that I'll come into. A very quick breakdown on MMM versus MTA. So multi-touch attribution is MTA. They're not the same thing, although they can be used in synchronous, or together is a better word. MMM is much more of the macro view. It's measuring the broad effect of marketing. It's telling you what your ROI is. It's not relying on user data. Multi-touch attribution is mostly dependent on user data, and it's giving you a credit for each pound you spend to each of the digital touch points that someone may have passed on their way to converting. So multi-touch attribution is a much more granular view based upon user data, and it's specific for campaign optimization or determining, I guess, the true customer journey and where they've landed in their conversion path. Whereas MMM is much more about macro budget allocation, strategic planning, and determining incremental ROI.
Jake, there was one question here from Mehul, which you missed
Yes.
covering, and if so, we can come on to it. But what needs to be the channel and spend spread to make MMM work? In the past, Mehul's have been advised 60% spend across 3 channels and decent spend on brand top of funnel.
We're going to come on to it, but I would say that I don't think I could give a figure of like 60% split from what I've seen in my career thus far. What I would say though is varied media mix is very important. For example, if you just spend on PPC, there's no point in doing something like a media mix model, because there's other better methods, cheaper potential methods to determine incrementality of PPC. For example, running an experiment. And in terms of like the top of funnel versus bottom of funnel split, I wouldn't say personally that there's a hard and fast rule to what that split should be. But naturally, MMM is a great driver to determining the incremental ROI of your top of funnel brand media. So if you are doing any brand media, and I would even say, I think at Farfetch, we had 20% of the performance budget was brand media. And based upon the budget, in relative terms, that was still quite a large volume of where the spend was going. So it was worthwhile. But if you have a budget of more like £1 million a year, for example, and 5% of that is going on top of funnel, then it might not have the power for the actual marketing mix model itself to be able to tell you what is the performance or the measurement of that activity. So the boring data answer is that it depends.
Thank you.
Great. And this is kind of in line with what that question was being asked, but MMM is definitely not for everyone. And I can't also say that I came up with this term, the 3 Ts. This was something that I heard from a guy called Jim, who runs Causal Analytics. So thank you, Jim. But too little if you don't spend enough on media. So for example, if you're only spending less than maybe £50,000 a month or $50,000, there's probably better ways to do it. Channels, as I just previously mentioned, if you're not spending on multiple media mix with a variety of different marketing interventions, again, potentially better ways, and variability too. So that's in terms of your spend changes over time or the amount of sales that you've had over time. If everything's too consistent and small, it's very hard for the model to get an accurate read. Same thing in terms of the granularity. The previous mentions of attribution that we touched on are much more akin to more granular, specific optimization. If you really care about measuring your spend on a daily basis, MMM is not the tool for you. Likewise, if you want to determine the impact of your creative or different keywords, again, MMM is probably too top line, too macro for that decision-making process. And this is something that John touched on in terms of too long. And this is why, which we're going to come on to, MMM in the B2B context can work, but is slightly more nuanced. So when things have a longer sales cycle, more considered purchases, it can be a little bit trickier to, again, infer that accuracy to be able to give you the confidence to use the model to make better decisions. This is it, guys. This is what you get from an MMM, very simply put. This is the whole model in one slide. Not exactly, but this is one of the valuable features of MMM, is that it explains these key drivers of your business in terms of their impact on revenue. So for example, in this scenario, you can see that new product development is having a massive spike in terms of how incremental revenue is being assigned to that activity. And you can also use this to see what your base is. So you can see that there's a steady increase of their base over time, which is great because that means the business has the brand equity, it's growing, people are naturally wanting, they have that natural demand for this product or service. And it's a great driver of seeing things like organic, and in this case, SEO. It's proving the incremental ROI of that activity as well, which may be quite tricky to infer from other sources. And this is actually very similar to what we mentioned in the ROAS optimizations, but it's a very similar process of allocating capital to the most impactful channels. The way of thinking about it, when we mentioned the ROAS-based optimizations, that uses your internal attribution to be able to then produce this solution to guide where you should be spending or scenario plan. But within MMM's using this view, this MMM attribution, to then also be able to follow this same process of, one, creating the S-curve, two, using things like optimization algorithms to tell you exactly how much you should be spending on each channel. And it can also support, I guess, more granular media planning, for example, like phased approaches to spending. So if you really want MMM, what can you do? Well, there's a number of options available to you. And I think due to the surge in popularity, this is something which has become more accessible than ever. So you kind of have this half-half split with your media agencies and your traditional consultancies. So media agencies, people like Mediacom, Saatchi, 7 Stars, you know, the big ones typically will have a MMM function. And there can be some good of using them. For example, you can benefit from economies of scale if they also do your paid media. They've got lots of expertise. They come across lots and lots of different companies, so they can give you pretty solid advice in terms of creating your media plan. But you don't necessarily want people in charge of your media spend marking their own homework. And similarly with the consultancies like New Star, Analytic Partners, Nielsen, they've got a great reputation in the market, especially someone like Analytics Partners. That's what we used at Farfetch, actually. However, they're pretty expensive. And they have these proprietary models which you don't really understand. And that was kind of the issue at Farfetch, to be honest, where the marketing teams didn't understand or trust the model and therefore didn't want to actually use it. Nowadays, you have these two other options in terms of SaaS, so things like Salesforce, Cassandra, LifeSite, and they're pretty easy to use and integrate with. However, they're quite self-serve, so you don't get that implementation consultancy. And the same thing with open source. Nowadays, Robin have got their own MMM open source package. Open source, by the way, means it's on the internet. Anyone can use it. It's free to use. You just need to have the technical nous and know-how to be able to translate that into a model. And that sounds great in terms of using, you know, Google's Meridian or Meta's Robin. But just because you have the code doesn't actually mean you can produce the model. That was something that we also learned at Farfetch. So there's still a kind of a technical gap when it comes to that, even though it sounds great that it's free. Typically, you still do need someone who's built these models before. So what should you look out for when you're working with your MMM vendor? So for example, if you have a media agency or a consultancy, these are the things that you should be looking out for. I'm just going to quickly go through this because I guess if someone is working with a vendor and they have some questions, you can feel free to reach out to me as a bit of an independent third party to help validate. But the accuracy, just because the actual modeling metrics look good, doesn't necessarily mean the model is good. Similarly, if you're not seeing cost efficiencies over time and you're on a long-term contract, that's an issue because the modeling should, in theory, get easier over time. If, for example, the media agency is pushing you also to launch multiple KPIs or multiple markets, but the spend isn't that high, within that market, that also represents an issue. So yeah, not to get too stuck into this, but there's a variety of different things that you should look out for. And accuracy in telling a story and making you commit to more models, and not seeing those cost efficiencies is kind of where some alarm bells will be ringing. I know that we've got a lot of marketing people on the call. Potentially even everyone is a marketing person. So just as an FYI, if you leverage a MMM solution, you are still going to be needed. So you're going to have to support in terms of the requirements, typically access to sources, helping validate the model, and the crucial one that we've put in a different color here of adoption. So you can build the most robust, fantastic, sophisticated model on earth, but unless you, the marketing teams, are actually using that, it's all worthless and it's not valuable. So please, if we're going to do an MMM, be ready to actually implement the insights on your side. And quickly, in terms of MMM, I know we've touched a lot about its functionality, and there were some questions over, can this be used for more high consideration purchases? Well, yes, it can. So two of our clients, we have a D2C example and we have a B2B example. Viva, a beauty brand, they are omnichannel, and Twilio is a B2B SaaS business. The aim of these businesses are the same, but there's fundamental differences. That means that the Twilio case study makes the modeling much more tricky. So for example, if you just think about the sales funnel with Vive, if we think about e-commerce, someone would land on the website and then convert. If you think about the B2B SaaS funnel, you go into a much more deep conversion funnel. So for example, like you go from the marketing qualified lead to sales qualified lead to signing up and then to potentially converting. So the point here is that you need to be a lot more creative if you want to use MMM in the B2B context, and that might mean multiple models across multiple KPIs. The other issue for all companies, but specifically important for B2B, is the dependency on data quality. So for example, if they don't have that SQL data or even sales data, SDR data available, that might represent a slight issue. So is MMM for you? Definitely. But you need to have a varied media mix. So spend on more than one channel, preferably two. Have a high volume of spend more than 50K a month, have provable, trusted data quality, and have a consistent KPI. So making sure that your spend actually does correlate with media. So it's not available for all. And then if you want to use it for these use cases of annual planning, etc., it's the perfect tool for you. So to basically finish off, the main point here is that it's like every other model. It helps you bring predictability to your media spend, but it's also an investment, right? Consider the pros and cons of leveraging econometrics. There's other cheaper methods of attribution as well in terms of what we referenced before. And it's not for everyone too in terms of their business size and readiness. A quick note on incrementality testing. This was just to refresh where we are. Incrementality testing is the main driver of the truth. So all these other things are models or trackables, but testing is the ground truth. And it's really for everyone. If you have a low budget, you can do a A/B split testing. If you're a smaller business too, you might be a bit more bullish. So for example, just switch spend off for a month and run a pre-post survey. And same thing, if you have a high budget, you can do some more sophisticated testing around causality or geolifts. And also the incrementality testing results can feed back into your models, for example, MMM, to make the MMM more valuable. And this is great for a more granular view in terms of your campaign or creative. I think we've touched on this, but it's the truth. But why people don't always opt for testing is because there's an opportunity cost. For example, a holdout, it might not always be feasible. There's lots of marketing interventions, and the fear is always that there is inconclusive results. So this is pretty much where we're wrapping up. There's a quick note on who we are at Day One Data, which I'll whiz through in a second. But If you want internal attribution, anyone can do it. It's for continuous measurement. If you want to use the internal attribution model to optimize in that ROAS world, that's also possible for businesses with that lower funnel spend. If you want to do MMM, that's also great, but you might need a varied media mix and high spend. But regardless, everyone should be testing. So this is the day one data team. This is a blend of pretty much ex-file fetchers in an advisory and consultant style. We've worked with some amazing companies across B2B SaaS, beauty, food and bev, e-com, retailers as well. And our main USP is that all of those solutions that we just mentioned are within our wheelhouse of products. So instead of needing multiple tools, teams, etc., we do it all from the infrastructure to the MMM and also to the analytics itself. So the reason why we actually kicked off the business in the first place is because spending on marketing analytics has gone through the roof, and we just wanted to make it simple for businesses to have a one-stop shop for working with data teams to help optimize their media activity. And we're pretty cautious that people don't want to work with us forever. So our USP is that we build internal products for you. So that means you can take it over yourself or even bring someone else in to take our work forward. So it's a pretty flexible model. We're cheaper than hiring a whole team. And in terms of how we operate, when it comes to data foundations, we build from scratch. We can work within any stack. So that means it doesn't matter what technology you have. And we always build the infrastructure that's right for you. So it's not a one size fits all. It's something that's built and catered directly for you. In terms of analytics, it's subscription based. So we basically are a full data team across engineering, data science, analytics, product. So instead of you having to hire a full team, you can work with us on a fractional basis, but as an entire team. And then in terms of MMM, which I know we touched on quite a lot, our main differentiating factor is that we build the in-house IP for you. So instead of working with these proprietary models, we build the model specifically for you. And we also support with implementation consultancy. So that means we help you make the media plan and work with the media agency as well on your behalf to actually make sure that this ground truth and optimized scenario is factored in. And that's it. So if you're a company of any size, that's our pretty much our MO is we help you make better decisions. We help you accelerate growth. And yeah, I think we've just about made it in time with no time for questions.
We did have a couple as we go. One thing I just wanted to highlight, though, was a great question from Mehul, which is, what is a good benchmark for MMM ROI? So in the last minute, John, do you just want to share what you put in chat in case people missed it?
Yeah, I said I would want like 3x the potential optimizations based on the cost that you've put in, because ultimately doing the MMM is a commitment in terms of getting your team to sense check the data, etc. I think I just wanted to caveat, there's no guarantee that you can find 10. If a company says we're going to find 10x optimizations for you, they're lying, because it's impossible to know until you kind of do it. So I think it's kind of like a judgment call on, do you think you can be more efficient, and working with a team to get those optimizations in place. Right. You can do simple things like just doing the budget optimizer piece, which is less work. And then from that, you can move on to MMM would be my suggestion.
Fabulous. Well, we're bang on 2 o'clock. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. There was some good insights in the chat as well. And Mehul, I'm delighted that you got all your questions answered. We'll also try and include a couple of those bullet points that were in chat in the email as well. So I will be sending out the recording and the deck and any other interesting insight that Jake and John want to share as well. If they have further questions, what's the best way for them to contact you?
Yes, if you have any questions, LinkedIn, I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, so I'll probably,
I'll share your LinkedIn profiles as well. But otherwise, Jake at Day One Data. Thank you so much, Jake and John. That was fabulous. A whistle-stop tour. I think I need to watch the recording again because there's a lot to take in from there. And any feedback or questions, obviously feel free to pop me a note as well. So enjoy the afternoon and thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thanks all.
Thank you.